Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
This episode is brought to you by La Quinta by Wyndham. Your work can take you all over the place, like Texas. You've never been, but it's going to be great because you're staying at La Quinta by Wyndham. Their free Bright Side breakfast will give you energy for the day ahead. And after, you can unwind using their free high-speed Wi-Fi. Tonight, La Quinta. Tomorrow, you shine. Book your stay today at lq.com.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is Berkeley political scientist Stephen Fish, author of the recently released book, Comeback: Routing Trumpism, Reclaiming the Nation, and Restoring Democracy's Edge, which we'll be discussing today. Stephen Fish, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
So we'll start, obviously, with Donald Trump, because the whole Trump phenomenon, I guess, and if someone were to ask me to describe how Donald Trump got to be where he is, and more generally, I think, probably the larger rise of right-wing nationalist populism, the story I'd probably tell them is something like this. Liberal elites embraced this globalist identity politics. A large part of the electorate, particularly non-college educated white males, felt really abandoned by that. And then to make matters even worse, these people who looked down their noses at them were constantly characterizing them as these moronic, racist, sexist, Bible-thumping homophobes, and their time is coming to an end, and thank God for that. So, to me, that's the standard narrative. That's at least my standard narrative. I want to get your take on that standard narrative.
I think there's something to it. The left oftentimes criticizes globalization for inducing despair in the working person and deindustrializing America and so on. What I found in my data actually is that that story tends to be overwrought, that in strictly economic terms, that ordinary and working class people in the United States actually have not been suffering from globalization as much as many on the left think they have. If you look back at the numbers and compare things over the past decade with, say, the 1970s, a time in which much of the left regards, America as having been a better place and, part of this golden age of early post-war middle-class expansion. What you see is, in fact, working class people's morale is not substantially lower now than it was back then. Their feeling of job insecurity isn't that much lower. Yes, some industries, of course, have gone down, but deindustrialization really, happened a few decades ago. There's still a bit of it going on right now. But remember, for every bit of deindustrialization that happens, we've had reindustrialization. The left seems to be very nostalgic for a kind of time of the mills and the mines. And frankly, I don't think life in the mills and the mines was all that much more advantageous for people than life behind a computer screen or behind a counter. And so I think the left tends to romanticize that time. But on the other part of what you were saying, on the cultural side, I think there is a lot to this. And, the feeling that a lot of working class people have that liberal elites look down on them, I think is an enormous problem. And that gets back to the way liberal elites message in politics. It's also the way it also has a lot to do with what people experience in the schools, what they see their kids getting in schools. We have to face the fact, I'm a liberal, but I have to face the fact that only about 25% of my fellow Americans are also liberals. But for non-liberals, the situation is the following. 80, 85, 90% of school teachers are Democrats. The vast majority of clergy people and physicians and lawyers and cultural figures are Democrats. And these, people who are not liberals oftentimes, I think, feel kind of overwhelmed in a world of liberal leaders in their ordinary lives as well as in politics. Then you add the vibe that we look down on them. And I do think you have a formula for the kind of resentment that could lead to a Trump. But again, in my findings, it's really more the cultural than the economic dimension that helps explain this phenomenon.
I definitely want to talk a lot about the cultural dimension. But before we do, I want to push back maybe, I don't know if it's pushing back exactly, but ask you a few more questions about that economic dimension, because there's also, I think, this story, even on the left, that suggested back in the day, even if the mines and the factories weren't all that great, it was possible for a single earner family to actually do reasonably well in the America of the 1950s and 1960s, that kind of post-war, some people call it a golden age, as long as you were, not a minority or trans or something like that. And I think the left looks back to that with a certain nostalgia. Certainly the right does, that whole MAGA sort of make America great again thing. But isn't there something to that, the idea that you just simply can't get by in a 21st century America on a single earner, non-college educated income?
No, there's not. This is the story that everybody believes, Michael. The fact is, in the 1950s, people considered themselves getting by and getting by well if they were able to rent a decent apartment. And if they were able to buy a little, 1,000 square foot home, they thought they were rich. A family had one car. That's what counted as the good life. These days, people would consider that penury. A lot of it is a problem of rising expectations. A lot of the folks who we think are really having a hard time and just barely scraping by drive $75,000 Dodge Ram 3500s. And yes, it's expensive to fill those gas tanks up. It takes about $150, I think, to fill them up. But the fact is that we tend to glorify this era and say that people could really get by then. A single wage earner could bring home enough bacon to supply a family of four. But what they consider to be an acceptable standard of living is just different from today. What's more, we need to recognize that this golden era, or what the left oftentimes considers a golden era, between about 1945 and 1980 or so, was a time in which, for a large part of that era, Black people in the South couldn't vote. The female workforce participation ratio was radically lower than it is today. That begins to rise in 1980, right? So this golden era was really a golden era for the most part for white men. And I think we need to keep that in mind. We also need to keep in mind that a lot of us who are, really nostalgic for this old golden era really never, kind of lived it as working class people ourselves. There's a great deal of nostalgia on the part of the overeducated liberal left for this era, even though, few of us or our parents worked in the coal mines or the steel mills. We just assumed that those lives were really great for everybody but that had those lives. It's not entirely clear how many people, given the choice, would go back to lives in those mills and the mines from the kinds of lives that they're leading today. We don't know for sure, but my hunch is that we tend to kind of romanticize this era. It's not that there was nothing good about it. Of course there was in many ways. And in the early post-war decades, the United States, let's say at least 1940s, 50s, 60s, were a time of good feelings in the United States and a time of an early post-war boom. But already by the 1970s, the economy was turning down. As you know, by the late 60s, early 70s, we had major clashes over civil rights. Again, we can romanticize that period, but we have to keep in mind that, the civil rights problems, the civil violence problems of those days were far greater than anything we have today. I remember, when I was a 5-year-old kid back in 1967, my dad was managing gas stations in Detroit. He managed a couple of gas stations. We lived right on the edge of the city. And I can remember one night he took me outside and pointed to this orange glow in the sky. What was going on were the Detroit riots of 1967, in which whole portions of the city burned down. And he told me a story. He said, I know you don't understand this right now, but let me explain to you what's going on. And he told me a story of a gas station that he worked at, and there was an alleyway behind the gas station. And he said, in that alleyway, a certain game was played. That game involved police officers dragging young African-American men into the alley, telling them to run for it, and then shooting them in the back or the legs. It was just kind of life in Detroit then. And I already, even as a little kid, understood what he was talking about, that these riots were, an act of rage against the kind of lives that African Americans lived in Detroit at the time. Whole segments of the city burned. Today, we can't imagine anything that awful. And again, we romanticize that period. But I think if we go back and study its history, in fact, just in my memory as someone who's in his early 60s, I don't think things were always quite as halcyon as we oftentimes imagine them to be. I think we have much better lives today.
Even granting that, because I certainly agree with that in most respects, there does seem to be a difference in terms of what I might call economic optimism. I see a lot of surveys, people say, well, my own economic status is reasonably okay, but the country's economy is going to hell. I think my kids aren't going to have the sort of future that I had. And so maybe that's another way to look at the economic argument, not so much where people are, but how optimistic they are about the future. And that certainly seems to have changed since in the past.
I think that's right. And so we have to ask ourselves why that is the case. It's not objective circumstances. Objective circumstances today are not worse. In fact, they're much better than they were 40 or 50 or 60 years ago. Part of it is expectations. Again, a person could own a car, one car in a family, live in a decent apartment, and consider themselves well off in the 1950s. That was living the American dream. Today, we regard that as terribly unfair if we have to live under those kinds of circumstances. And we think that every family should have two cars and live in a bigger home and so on, and have a lot of savings. And let's face it, if we look back to the generations that came of age between, about the 1920s and the 1950s, complaining was against their religion. They actually thought that part of the responsibility was to enjoy life as they had it. We tend to have a little bit higher expectations today. So I think that's part of it. But another part of it, Michael, is really a political problem. And that's that elites, and I think the job here falls to liberal elites, are doing a much worse job than we used to at creating a sense of optimism and forward movement. So these days, the economy's crackling. It's doing extremely well. It's doing much better than other advanced industrialized economies, and has been for a long time. Inflation is, almost back to normal. Unemployment has not been this low for this long since a moment of the late 1960s. And before that, you have to go back to the early 1950s. And unemployment's what really matters the most in terms of people's security. When unemployment stays below 4% year after year after year, you're living in a very prosperous economy. So objective circumstances are actually pretty good. And yet, if you look at surveys, half the people will say the economy is getting worse. And, maybe a quarter will say it's getting better, something like this. Okay, so what's the problem here? Are we just spoiled whiners? Yes, that's part of the problem. But I don't really think that gets us very far, especially if we want to beat people like Trump and extinguish the threat of Trumpism. I think here the problem is that liberal elites do a much worse job than they used to at conveying a sense of good feeling and optimism and forward progress. These days, I think oftentimes liberal elites feel like if they celebrate past progress and they talk about future prospects with a great deal of optimism, that somehow they're being insensitive to those who still suffer, or they will be seen as not feeling the pain of people who may not be thinking they're doing all that well. The fact is, people believe what their leaders tell them. If leaders tell people, things are going pretty well now, then for a lot of people will believe it. If I've looked at the data on economic confidence and also on public evaluation of politicians' management of the economy. You go back some decades on this, and what you find is, for example, is that if you look at Gallup's Economic Confidence Index, that ECI, that it was very high under Bill Clinton, and it was quite high under Donald Trump, but it really sags under Barack Obama, and it's rock bottom under Joe Biden. Now, why would that be the case? It doesn't reflect objective economic circumstances. Biden's economy is better than Trump's was, for example. Obama's economy was really very good. I mean, he saved us from a global Great Depression, gave us health care, and then his second term in office was a time of rising prosperity in the United States. Well, so what's the deal here? Why would people not know that the economy is doing as well under Biden and Obama? Well, because they didn't tell you how great it was. They were constantly kind of fretting along with you and telling you, well, things are better than they would be if we weren't in power, but they could still be a lot better. And sorry, things aren't going better for you, but we're doing all we can. This kind of mamby-pamby messaging leaves people feeling, like they're not necessarily doing all that well. Donald Trump never made that mistake. When he's out of power, the world's going to hell in his rhetoric. But when he's in power, he tells you happy days are here again. He tells you the American dream is back and how great things are. I got news for you. That's a winning message. When the Democrats are in power, they tell people how, that they call them struggling working families. How many times, Michael, have you heard that term, right? We say, we know you're struggling. We know you're hurting. And we're here to provide you with a government supplied break. Now, the fact is that's not a winning message in the United States. The Democrats think they're doing something very smart here, which is showing people how much they feel their pain and then swooping in with well thought out programs to help them. But the United States is got a wide libertarian streak. And like all societies, working class people, middle class people are proud. They want to feel like they can provide for themselves. And the story we tell them, which is, you poor sots, you're really in trouble now. We know the American dream is dying for you. So here's some government programs to help you out, is precisely, it's the center, I think, of what working class people have come to regard as a profoundly patronizing message. Bill Clinton never made that mistake. John Kennedy and FDR never made that mistake. They cast their progressive programs as, first of all, part of a general push to make America greater than it had ever been, to advance the American way. John Kennedy talked about conquering want and injustice as showing the world what America was made of. FDR cast his progressive programs as just what he constantly called the American thing to do. They cast their programs as part of this grand national project. What's more, they created a sense of optimism and forward movement. They weren't afraid to tell you that things were going well on their watch. Democrats these days have lost their capacity for understanding that if you want to win people over, you have to create a sense of optimism and forward movement. You have to celebrate past accomplishments that you yourself have been responsible for. And, telling people that they're a bunch of, struggling working families that can't get by with a government break is not a winning message in the United States.
There's you mentioned Bill Clinton, and there's a saying that's attributed to him, and that strong and wrong beats weak and right, and made me think about what you were saying there, certainly. And the Trump message is certainly strong, and a lot of us on the left would say it's absolutely wrong. And we kind of contrast that, I guess, with what we hear from a lot of Democratic elites, and we would maybe characterize it more as weak and right. Is that kind of what you're getting at here?
I'm sorry, Michael, I didn't quite understand the question.
Sure. Idea that former President Clinton used to say that strong and wrong beats weak and right. And it seems to me that's kind of what you're saying, is that the Republican message, the Trumpian MAGA message, has been very, very strong. And the strength matters more than whether it's right or not. And that's what people are responding to, the strength in the Trumpian message, and the weakness of the Democratic message, not getting into whether it's right or wrong.
No, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So the problem we face here is that the good guys are oftentimes regarded as weaker than the bad guys. When you get to that situation, you're really in trouble. And in fact, as I did the book, I realized this is a central problem in American politics. And in fact, in politics in many countries where democracies come under challenge, is that the liberals, and I mean liberal in the broad sense, not just necessarily people on the left, but, center-right people, basically advocates of the rule of law and of democracy, are viewed by mass publics as being less tough, as being weaker than the illiberals. And, people seek strength in their leaders. This is not unnatural. It's not problematic. The fact is, this is in our DNA. We seek leaders, who are strong. If your favorite liberal leader has got all the right ideas and all the right policies, and yet doesn't have the ability to own his or her opponents and to command the field, then you're not going to trust his or her ability to implement his or her policies anyway, right? So strength in some sense, and what I call a high dominance orientation, is the thing that makes possible the activation of all other virtues in politics. Because if you're not strong and seen as strong, you're not going to be able to get all that much done anyway. And what I've noticed, Michael, looking around the world at situations outside the United States as well, in recent decades, is a very interesting phenomenon. And noticing this is part of what led me to write this book on the United States. Most of my work has actually been on other countries. I'm a comparative political scientist. But what I saw was a kind of global phenomenon, which was all over the world, where you get these illiberal challenges to democracy, from Narendra Modi in India to Viktor Orban in Hungary to the Law and Justice Party in Poland to Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, all over the world, and now with the Republicans under Trump in the United States, is that these new would-be autocrats project an image of great strength and decisiveness and patriotism as well. They seem to understand that politics is a dominance game, and it's also a contest to capture the flag. They're onto something really very important here. And as liberals throughout the world have become squeamish about dominance, have become squeamish about, hardcore political competition, and decided that politics isn't a blood sport and it shouldn't be won, and can't we all just get along here? This has opened them up to being devoured, frankly, by these super predators like Narendra Modi and Donald Trump and Viktor Orban, who do not regard playing, do not regard observing rules of civility and being nice and depolarizing as is their main way of doing politics. And oftentimes liberals have just found themselves flat-footed. They don't know what to do when these bullies come along. Chris Rock had this great routine where he said, he was talking about bullies, and he said, we have this he was kind of chiding or making fun of how on schoolyards these days that no more fights are allowed of any type. Even disagreements are looked down on. And as soon as somebody and one kid bugs the other, you have to run to the school administrator. And so he said, what happened is that, we got rid of bullying, we got rid of bullies, and then a real bully came along and we didn't know what to do with him. So an ethic kind of grew up on the left against, quote unquote, othering people. The notion that we should all be able to get along, the idea that everybody's intuitions and feelings are equally valid. Well, the problem is that when you're dealing with people who think the rules are for suckers and that winning is all that matters, you're not going to fare very well against those people unless you toughen up and unless you're seen as being as strong or stronger than they are. the bad guys are going to seem stronger under the circumstances. Then there's the problem of nationalism. Liberals have gotten very squeamish in recent decades about nationalism. Well, most people in this world are very patriotic. They love their countries. They're proud of them. They're grateful to be part of the societies they're in. And as liberals have abandoned the flag, the bad guys, the ethno-national illiberals, have picked up the flag. So throughout the world, what I've seen from India to the United States is that the illiberals understand that nationalism is still the world's most powerful ideological force, and that strength wins. People want strong leaders. They want commanding leaders, not petitioners, not leaders who just, read polls in the morning and then tell you what they think you want to hear in the afternoon based on polling results. They want leaders who ignore polls. They want leaders who step out and say, I don't really care what the polls show. What I want to do is tell you what I think and what I think what I want you to believe. Frankly, that's what Trump does. And liberal leaders for an awful long time now have just watched polls and then fed back to us what they think, that what it seems like we want to hear. Trump doesn't do that. That's his superpower. It's what makes him look so strong. He's never met a pollster he wasn't happy to ignore.
I want to ask you about that strength message, because what I hear when I listen to part of a Trump rally or a Trump speech or read his, true social things is a part of that. But what comes to me more than that even is grievance. Like he's the biggest whiner, the greatest victim in the history of humankind. And I guess it's hard for me to square that with strength, because it seems to me that weak people are the ones who complain about the refs are, not going the right way and the game's rigged against them. And I guess I'm trying to reconcile that with a message of strength, because that feels like very weakness to me.
Yes, Trump in some ways is very weak. His whining is, a mark of a weakling. The fact is, a lot of these high dominance, illiberal leaders are really wimps inside. If you scratch them, what you'll find is a very weak person. That goes for Putin. That goes for Trump. That goes for Hitler. These people were not strong people. But the fact is liberals did not stand up to them. And so these leaders were able to cultivate reputations for strength. So Trump's whininess, in fact, is a sign of weakness. We all know what a weak little punk Trump is, right? The problem is that we don't stand up to him. How can you expect to reveal, to uncover the cowardice of somebody who you won't stand up to? Go back to 2016 and Hillary Clinton. Go through to the present day. How often do Democratic leaders step out and treat Trump the way you treat a whiny little punk, which is just ignore him and ridicule him and taunt him and get on with it? If we did that, we would expose what a whiny little punk he is. But we don't do that, Michael. We don't do that. We take him seriously. We get offended by everything he says. And our message, rather than being, did you hear what that guy said? Like, what a joke, is, did you hear what Trump, that is so awful. Did you hear, look at how offensive that was. Then Trump's game is, he plays it again. He says it again, but even badder, right? Then we say, oh my God, did you hear that? He called this group that, or that group another thing. Isn't that offensive? Now the right-wing media machine is playing our umbrage, our righteous indignation, wall to wall. Trump's the only guy out there saying anything. All we do is react and fact check and be offended. And, the liberal social media bubble swells with umbrage. Libs owned. Trump's mission accomplished. We don't treat him as the punk he is. If we did that, we would reveal his weakness. I've got a chapter in the book on this as well. And instead, we're afraid of Trump. We're constantly reveling. We're constantly being offended by him. You cannot be on the offense and be offended at the same time. We do have liberals who seem to know how to deal with these types. Jasmine Crockett, second-term congresswoman from Dallas. Look at the way she deals with these MAGA miscreants on the floor of the House. She really knows how to have fun eviscerating them. But we typically don't do that. Liberals don't want to so-called, get down in the mud with these people. We're not, and so Trump's going to command the field as long as that's the case. But there are reasons why Trump is regarded as strong or is felt to be strong. And I mentioned one of them before. He ignores polls. Trump doesn't really care what the polls say. He tells you what he thinks. He does not poll test everything he says. In fact, he doesn't really poll test anything. That people experience as a real sign of strength. What's more, he plays to win and win big, right? Liberals just hope to squeak by on the Republicans' abortion bans. He is risk acceptant. The guy loves taking risks. Liberals are pathologically risk averse. This is another low dominance trait. Trump, moreover, isn't afraid of othering his opponents, right? He knows politics, has two sides. He's from the corporate world. Everybody in corporate knows that dominance matters. Everybody who plays professional sports knows it as well, who's in law enforcement or the military. But liberal politicos don't seem to understand this fact. They don't seem to understand that, that you have to play to win and win big and defeat your opponent. And the victory is the goal. And othering your opponent and adopting an us versus them mentality is just part of a good game. Liberals recoil at an us versus them mentality. In fact, the very phrase evokes, we break out on the hives when we hear that kind of thing. Republicans don't, and that's part of why they're regarded as stronger than we are. Also, Trump uses, transgressive language. Liberals are so afraid of being transgressive. We're so concerned with somehow observing the norms of civility that we never say anything interesting. And for that reason, oftentimes we're regarded as lacking passion, lacking commitment, being incapable of really getting angry because, we really don't feel it. There's something about using transgressive language and breaking the norms of civility that makes a person look genuine to people. And the liberals, for the most part in recent decades, have quit doing that.
I want to propose an alternate explanation for a lot of this and get your response, because I could hear a lot of folks on the left saying that, well, the problem with that sort of approach, just from putting aside the morality or ethics, what have you of it, is that electorally it's not going to work in the long term, because you take a look at Donald Trump, in a lot of ways he's an extraordinarily weak candidate. His negatives are super high. The only reason he's gotten to the point he is because of an inept, hubristic campaign by Hillary Clinton, who was a horribly weak candidate, and just some unique circumstances. And they can point to someone like, say, no drama Obama, right, being very technocratic and above the fray, and that who won with big majorities and seemed to have a very different kind of message. And I think a lot of folks on the left would say the problem is just not so much Donald Trump and and his high dominant style, but we've just fielded a couple of particularly really weak candidates who no one had much enthusiasm for, and that's really the heart of things. So what do you think about that sort of response?
I think that high dominance candidates evoke much more enthusiasm than low dominance candidates do. One of the reasons why John Kennedy, to this day, is regarded as such an icon is that he made people feel great about the country, and he made people feel like he was a great, strong leader who was getting our work done for us. He was an extraordinarily high dominance figure. Martin Luther King as well, an extraordinarily high dominance figure, a guy who always told you exactly what he thought without regard for what he thought you wanted to hear. A guy who was willing to, break every kind of norm of civility, quote unquote, in order to press his cause. Someone who, always played to win, who was extraordinarily risk acceptant. These are characteristics of high dominance leaders. Now, the kind of liabilities you point out that Trump has are real, and I completely agree with you. But the last thing we want to do, the last thing liberals want to do, is ape Trump's style. I'm not for a moment saying that we should ape his brand of dominance. His brand of dominance is boorish and sexist and egotistical and narcissistic and hubristic and authoritarian and everything else that we liberals rightly despise. And one of the problems here is that since Trump is all those awful things and a high dominance guy, liberals have come to associate dominance politics with all those things we rightly despise. But the fact is, those traits themselves are not high dominance characteristics, right? Those are Trump's characteristics. We have our own liberal tradition of high dominance politics that we can point to, for examples, we can point to Frederick Douglass, we can point to Abraham Lincoln or Martin Luther King or John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, someone who I think we could regard as an extremely high dominance politician. And if you look at American politics, Michael, during that middle third of the 20th century, what you're going to find is the period in which every progressive program that we liberals are fighting to safeguard today, are fighting a rearguard action to actually save, was put in place then by extraordinarily high dominance politicians, starting with FDR and going through JFK. If you really want to get things done, you've got to own your opponents. And that's what these guys did, right? We have our own liberal brand of dominance as well. And liberal high dominance politics is very different. First of all, we use it for pro-democratic ends. Second of all, the liberal high dominance politics leader never makes it just about himself or herself. Among illiberal high dominance leaders, whether you're talking about Viktor Orban or Narendra Modi in India or Donald Trump here, it's always about the main man, right? Only I can do it. There's always this kind of Führerprinzip, this notion that, there's one guy who's going to take care of business. High dominance liberal leaders like FDR or like MLK never make it all about themselves. It's always about us together, a justice-seeking people. That's the agent of history. So we have our own dominance a high dominance tradition that we can reclaim. Dominance is just a tool. It can be used for good or ill. When the bad guys are better at it than we are, then we're in trouble.
I noticed that when you mentioned the sort of high dominance Democratic Party leaders, a number of names came up. But one that didn't come up, notably to me at least, was Barack Obama. And I'm wondering what you think about, is that sort of style just sort of a thing that's unique to him and that really wouldn't necessarily transfer over? Or how would you characterize his leadership style?
Well, Obama, like most leaders, was a mix of characteristics. I think in some ways and at some times he was a very high dominance politician. He had, he was possessed of deep self-confidence. Obama really believed in himself. He was very comfortable with himself. He was not afraid to celebrate progress and to claim credit for progress, especially during his election campaigns. And he generated a tremendous feeling of optimism among Americans when he ran for president in 2008, and then he kind of reprised that in 2012. There were times when he was willing to step out and take unpopular positions. He, in many ways, really did have a high dominance style, at least at times during campaigns. I think the problem is that between electoral campaigns, he found himself oftentimes hemmed in by advisors who essentially advised him to go a lower dominance route. So I've got a chapter in the book on this. It's called Bridling the Boss. And it's about how the leaders around Obama, and this is actually a potential problem for Kamala Harris right now, were constantly telling him, you can't step out and talk about how great things are under your leadership because you see our polling is showing that not everybody's happy yet. And so don't go out and tell people how great the economy is doing because you'll be regarded as tone deaf and insensitive to those who still suffer. So they kept reining Obama in. So here's a guy that on the campaign trail was gangbusters. It was just all Obama. Anytime it's a presidential campaign, the candidate's front and center. But between elections, he oftentimes was reined in by these advisors who told him that you can't step out with a strong message on how great things are until our polling is showing that everything's fine. This is a losing way to do politics. A strong politician leads. If polling shows that people don't seem to be feeling all that much better, the strong politician goes out and helps make them feel better by telling them how great things are and telling them how much greater things are going to be. You can show that you feel someone's pain and still produce that kind of optimism. for lessons here, we need to look to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We need to look to leaders like John Kennedy. They were very good at this. And liberal leaders today, they just follow polls until the polls tell them that everybody's happy. They don't want to step out and talk about how great things are. That is a losing way to do politics. And I'm hoping that Kamala Harris now understands these basic facts and will step out and tell people how good we've got it, how much better things are due to the Biden administration's policies. Of course, always say we understand the concerns of people who are still struggling. Of course, we're going to make things much, much better. But if you don't portray yourselves as a doer of great deeds, people will regard you as strivers who never succeed. If you don't portray yourself as someone who's actually gotten a great deal done, it's hard to get people excited about voting for you again. You know, a firm that wants to attract investment is constantly trying to show would-be investors how, you know, all the great things they've been doing. The same thing with politicians. If we want voters to invest in us by trusting us with their votes, we've got to show them all the great things we've done. Is it enough? No. But we still have to raucously celebrate past progress. Liberals these days seem to regard celebrating past progress as somehow insensitivity. And I think that's a huge problem.
You know, with Kamala Harris, who at this point is the presumptive nominee, I think it's safe to say that it seems to me that one of the issues, perhaps in this regard, is that she's from California. She hasn't really been in a highly contested race when she was on top of the ticket since, I think, 2010, which was her first race for Attorney General, I believe. And so I wonder if we should not be looking necessarily to states that are sort of Democratic cocoons, if you will, or safe spaces for Democrats, but if it's better to look for places where Democrats really have had to fight in a way to try to win over some of these voters for our future high dominance leaders. What do you think?
I think that we're probably going to have Vice President Harris as our candidate. That just seems to be the way things are going. It seems to be the easiest path to avoiding, major chaos between now and the convention and then after the convention. And it seems like, the party elders and indeed the party activists are falling in behind her. So I think that's who we've got. Now, you could make the argument that someone who comes from, say, a purple or a red state is going to be better attuned to how to capture the center, better attuned to the necessity of hard political combat than someone who comes from essentially one party state, where if you get the nomination, then you're going to win the election. That said, I think Vice President Harris is going to be our candidate. Now, as she casts about for vice presidential running mates, I think she probably should choose someone who fits that bill that we're talking about. So my favorite is Governor Andy Beshear of Kentucky. I'm from Kentucky myself. Beshear is terrific. Here's a guy who won re-election by 5 points against a Mitch McConnell protege last year in a state that Donald Trump carried by 26 points in 2020. So how does he do it? Well, is he just a conservative Democrat? Is he a Republican appeasing Democrat? No, he's really very progressive. The guy gets to office shortly after he's elected 5 years ago. What's the first thing he does? He reopens the Planned Parenthood clinic in Louisville. He marches in pride parades. He vetoes anti-abortion legislation. He had a COVID masking mandate. He had nightly COVID briefings where he would chide his fellow Kentuckians for not getting vaccinated and read out the names of everybody who had succumbed to COVID that day. He's really quite a liberal, and Kentuckians love him. Why? Because they might not agree with his policies necessarily or his liberal stances, but he has the courage of his convictions. He tells you what he thinks. He doesn't just read the polls and tells you what he thinks you want to hear. That's a high dominance trait, right? And what's more than Andy Beshear is extremely relatable. He does all this in a style. He wraps his dominance politics and indeed his whole governance in a style that is profoundly depolarizing. Everybody who knows Andy Beshear regards him as just kind of like their neighbor. And indeed, it's genuine in his case. He really does seem to be a profoundly depolarizing figure. He also is just a good guy. And, somebody who I think in some ways is very different from, say, our own Governor Newsom. Governor Newsom I think there's some substance there, but one could argue that some people think that he's really more style than substance. Beshear would be pretty much the opposite, right? He's all substance and not much style. But his homespun style, I think, could be very appealing. Look, this guy knows how to win in Kentucky as a Democrat. I think he would be a great addition to the ticket. Then we talk about Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, incredibly smart guy, really appealing in his own way, certainly a very high dominance figure. Roy Cooper, the governor of North Carolina, probably not my first pick. I'd like to see somebody younger. I'd like to see our ticket really, represent a generational change. Cooper is in his late 60s, kind of a patrician figure. Wouldn't be my first choice, but it's possible that Vice President Harris will choose him. And he's a Democrat who knows how to win in a kind of, reddish purple state. And there are other possibilities as well. But I think we've got a deep bench. I think there's a lot of talent in the Democratic Party. I do see the problem you mentioned with Vice President Harris. But here's the thing. She can overcome this problem. And the key, again, is stepping out and being a commanding leader. Vice President Harris spent her life before she got into politics as a prosecutor, as a district attorney. If she can portray herself as the hard-nosed, hard-assed, badass prosecutor who puts bad guys in jail, and Donald Trump is the felon who's in need of a jail term or at least a good spanking, she can win this election. But if she gets cold feet and allows the far left to dissuade her from stepping out with this very tough, crime-fighting, law-enforcing image and, retreats to this kind of lukewarm position where she doesn't really cast herself as this hard-nosed prosecutor, then she's going to lose. She's going to lose. This was a problem when she first ran for president, in 2019, 2020. She didn't own her credentials as a prosecutor because she kind of buckled when the far left said, "Oh, you're too putative. You don't have enough compassion for those who commit crimes." Then she backed down a little bit. If she does that in this election, she's going to lose to Donald Trump. If she realizes that the vast majority of Americans consider smart on crime to be tough on crime and want to see their leaders side with law-abiding citizens against those who make them insecure and commit crimes against them. If she realizes the gold that's in her resume and she really does double down on this, I think she's going to control the narrative and win this election and win it handily. She also, to this end, though, has to make a distinction between legal and illegal immigration. For some reason, liberals just don't seem to get this. Americans are a profoundly pro-immigrant people. We're more pro-immigrant than Europeans are. Of course, we're a nation of immigrants, and Americans have become much more liberal on immigration and on race and pretty much everything else in recent decades. But nobody in the world, except for a far left fringe, is good with illegal immigration. And for some reason, the Democrats don't seem to make a strong distinction between those two things. Increasing immigration quotas, legal immigration quotas from people from all over the world to make our nation greater, to advance our economic and cultural interests. That's a winning message. Allowing people to break the law and sneak over the border and live here illegally, and treating anyone who seeks strong border controls as somehow a kind of a racist or a nativist, that's a losing message. Harris has to step out and be in favor of legal immigration, orderly immigration, and tell a great story about how it's made our country the greatest country in the world. She embodies that story herself. She's the daughter of two immigrants from developing countries. But at the same time say, we are a nation of laws. We enforce the law in the United States. We're the party of the rule of law. That means everybody has to obey the law. She'll win this election.
I guess I see that the strength of Kamala Harris in this sense is that the things that made it almost impossible for her to win a Democratic primary, she doesn't have to worry about that because she doesn't have to run away from her history to attract those primary voters because she essentially got the nomination without having to run in any primaries. And it seems to me that you can even go further than that and say Democratic primary voters are very much attracted to low dominance folks, whereas Republican primary voters maybe are more attracted to high dominance folks. So we get to short circuit that whole process, at least for right now. But then on the other hand, given the fact that Kamala Harris has such a short runway, it might be the inclination to simply do the safe thing and not try anything crazy because there's not enough time to sort of come back from any missteps. And so that's kind of what I see as the positive and the negative. I wanted to get your take on that.
I think there is a danger she's going to just fall back on old habits. She is relatively young compared to President Biden and former President Trump, but she's 59 years old. She's been around for a while. And I do worry that she's going to fall back on old people-pleasing, trying to appease one side, trying to appease the other side, not taking a strong stance habits. And that will be her undoing. It's actually more important that she really present herself as a person of conviction who doesn't give a damn what you think. She's there to tell you what she thinks and to convince you of the righteousness of her argument. That's more important than she take the quote unquote right stance on any given issue. In other words, it's the perception of strength that is going to be even more important than whether she lines up with voters on a given issue. And I hope that she's going to step out and realize that. So what's more, when it comes to positioning herself on issues, I always think that issue positioning is kind of secondary compared to these other things, like how strong you're perceived as being, or how patriotic and excited about the country you're perceived as being. But to the extent that issue stances actually matter as well, I think she really does have to stake out centrist positions. Someone from the Bay Area who, is clearly a progressive politician is going to have a hard time playing in Peoria. There's no doubt about it. And she has this opportunity as a prosecutor against a felon to seize this law and order issue back from the Republicans who've used it against us to devastating effect for a long time on immigration. She has to say, look, Republicans sabotaged what was a very good deal that actually would have provided for a much more secure border, because Donald Trump sabotaged it because he didn't want the Democrats to have any policy wins. This goes back to earlier this year. And step out and basically make clear that she too is in favor of strong border controls. That's just a winning message, right? When it comes to some political hot button issues that are real fads on the left, trans issues and things like that, I think she needs to actually, stake out kind of commonsensical positions rather than in a knee-jerk way simply adopting the far left's positions on these issues. And I think if she does this and combines this with a high dominant style and really seizes the flag from the Republicans, this is another thing. I think she can win this thing easily. I think she can win by 150 electoral votes. I think she can win by 10 million popular votes. And if she does that well, then we're probably going to win back the House. The Senate, they might take. But if we win the presidency and the House, and she wins big, not only will we beat Trump, we will lick Trumpism. It's going to be hard for Trumpism in its current form to survive that kind of licking. And it's time for the Democrats to quit our precious pessimism and our moping and to get on with the task of thinking big. We can win this thing, and we can win really big. When you're up against Donald Trump, the sky's the limit. We can do it.
Well, that definitely is a very optimistic outlook. And I want to sort of turn things maybe into slightly more, I don't know if it's more pessimistic, but when I think about sort of the structural bases of a lot of these things, I think, well, we get the sort of candidates we get because of who shows up to vote in primaries. And it seems to me that even if Kamala Harris takes all this advice, and I think it's good advice, and wins, in the longer term, we're still dealing with the issue that the sort of people who come out to vote in Democratic primaries are the sort of, you call it low dominance, compassion, be concerned about everyone's feelings, that sort of thing. And so I'm not clear as to how we fix that structural issue aside from, I'd be fine for like a Australian style mandatory voting thing, but that's not going to happen. So how do we deal with that? Or do you even see that as a problem?
Okay, so this is a really good question. First of all, I think that, while primary voters tend to be politically extreme, the more extreme people are, the more motivated they are to come out to the polls. I don't think that among liberals that means that they seek low dominance leaders. They do seek, far lefties do love compassion, which is fine. I mean, that's part of our comparative advantage, right? Is that we've got that. That doesn't necessarily manifest as low dominance messaging, though, or political style. You can be very compassionate and very high dominance. Lyndon Johnson certainly was. I don't think that liberal leaders thirst for low dominance leaders. I think we thirst for progressive leaders. But progressives can be very high dominance. I mean, if you look at Lyndon Johnson, you look at MLK, they were high dominance figures. If you look at active politicians today, I'm thinking about Ruben Gallego, the guy who's running against Kerry Lake for Senate in Arizona. He's a congressman from Arizona, and he was just another congressman from Arizona. But when he really stepped out with this extraordinarily kind of high dominance attacks on these MAGA people in Congress, he became the nominee presumptive because everybody loved his energy. They loved his high dominance style. And he went on then handily to get the Democratic nomination. And now he's going to go on, and I think he's going to beat Kerry Lake. And he's very progressive. So there's no necessary contradiction between high dominance politics and progressive politics. And the fact is that we progressives, or we liberals, we like dominance in our own as much as anybody else. Think about Nancy Pelosi tearing up her hard copy of Donald Trump's, State of the Union speeches and throwing it aside. That went viral. We love that stuff. Gavin Newsom steps out, sticks it to Ron DeSantis. We love that stuff. Jasmine Crockett takes it to these MAGA miscreants on the floor of the House. It goes viral. Liberals love being strong as well. But I do see your point on the primaries, and let me shift a little bit to that. This does seem to be a structural problem. Our primary system does mean that the parties tend to nominate candidates who are less close to the center and further out to the extremes. We have to keep in mind, though, that the whole single-member district system we have for House elections was designed to encourage moderation. It was designed to encourage a two-party system, which in fact it does, and then competition between nominees of each party for the center, for the median voter. And smart primary voters were regarded as people who recognized that if they wanted to win, they had to nominate a relatively moderate candidate. So the system was actually designed to have the opposite effect of what it oftentimes seems to be having today. I think the broader problem, though, is that in the reason why I think, members of Congress, at least of the House, tend to, on the whole, be more extreme than most Americans are, is that most electoral districts in this country now are ideologically pretty pure, and most seats are pretty safe. Districts have been drawn in such a way as to be safe. Over the decades, this is the way it's worked out. What this means is that in the district I live in, if you get the Democratic Party nomination, you're going to be elected. You pick the district in the Inland Empire in California. If you get the Republican nomination, you're going to be elected. Now, look, in Idaho, whatever district you're in, it's going to be Republican. But I do think in areas closer to urban centers, that redistricting in a way that broke up these concentrations of ideological purity would be a very good thing. It's complicated to do. You can imagine a system in which you just took a big stamp with a grid on it and just poked it on a map and then did adjustments for population size. What you would come up with in the way of congressional districts, you would not get, these ideologically pure districts. You might even get, mixed districts. There are other ways of dealing with this problem as well, and some political scientists are working on this. Some are in favor of multi-member districts. Some are in favor of a system of proportional representation. And these might be ways of breaking up this polarization that you talk about. These institutional remedies, I think, are potentially really fruitful. The problem is it's very unlikely that they're ever going to be adopted, or at least anytime soon. Political scientists are working on this stuff all the time. but these would require fundamental changes in the way we govern ourselves. And some would require constitutional changes as well. So, I think ruminating and studying, ruminating about and studying how we could improve the situation in institutional terms is fruitful. I think we're stuck with the system we've got for now, though.
Well, one final question for you. Let's say that Democrats listen to this advice and adopt the more high dominance approach. It occurs to me that one problem with this is it could end up being sort of a race to the bottom, and our politics becomes more and more ugly and owning the libs or owning the conservatives, and it just descends into just awfulness. And I wonder if that's a legitimate concern.
No, it's not.
Okay.
It's legitimate. Of course, it's legitimate, Michael. But look, what has gotten us? Are you happy with the current state of American politics? You think it's not all that awful?
Pretty awful, yeah.
I think it's pretty awful. Right? How did it get so awful? These crazies, led by Donald Trump, unchecked by high dominance liberals, were able to do anything they wanted. They were able to destroy every sacred tenet of Americanism, to attack all the major pillars of Americanism, our democracy, our defense of democratic allies against our and their sworn enemies, our immigrant tradition, our tradition of economic freedom. These are not market fundamentalists. The Republicans, they're crony capitalists. They want a system in which they can get rich off of holding public office. They're Putin-style crony capitalists. Look at our political discourse. How much worse can it get? If the bad guys are dominating the good guys, and the good guys are, refusing to take on the norm busters and the anti-democratic forces, things get pretty ugly. When I hear liberals saying, we don't really want to fight back, do we? Because things could get really bloody. I say, well, whose country do you want this to be? Do you want to leave the flag? Do you want to leave our polity? Do you want to leave our political system in the hands of these monsters? Or do you want it to be our country? Liberals complain day in and day out about what bullies the Republicans are. And then we leave them in charge of the playground. At some point, you've got to stand up and fight back. Now, liberals are so afraid of polarizing politics that we don't want to be too tough. We don't want to other our opponents. Now, when both sides or all sides obey the rules of the game, when they observe norms of civility, when they play by the rules, when they take their toys and go home when they lose elections, when they agree that it should be easy for everybody to vote, then you can play, perhaps a less aggressive political game. But that's not what we're up against, Michael. We're up against people who think that the rules are for suckers and that winning is all that matters. We're up against people who do not even respect the outcome of free elections. We're up against people who thrive by polarizing the electorate, driving deep wedges between social groups and getting us to hate each other. Under those circumstances, the most polarizing thing you can do is to not fight back, because you're leaving the polity in the hands of the polarizers. What's more, you're allowing the polarizers to look stronger, to look more capable, to look more committed to their ends, to look better able to seize the reins and lead. And at that point, they've won the game, because creating the impression that authoritarianism is, quote unquote, stronger than democracy is at least half the battle. Once the authoritarians, whether they be Putin or Trump or Modi or Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, once they create the impression that liberals are weak, they've actually won. So oddly enough, under conditions such as we face right now, the best thing we can do to depolarize politics is to be tough with the polarizers. And we need to make it clear. We'll be happy to go back to living in a political arena in which everybody obeys, kind of observes the norms of civility. Once we win and we eliminate from the halls of power these people who are destroying our democracy. Our terms need to be that they obey the democratic rules of the game. Until then, we are down in the street fighting with every weapon we've got. And it makes no sense to try to play nice with people who are trying to kill you. And that's exactly what the liberals have been trying to do.
Well, that is definitely, I think, a strong message to end on. And so I think we'll stop right there. Steve Fish, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
My pleasure, Michael.
I don't generally include a postscript to interviews, but in this case, I wanted to make an exception because as much as I respect the research that Professor Fish put into his book, and he might even be right about the whole high dominance thing, something about it just strikes me as being fundamentally wrongheaded. And maybe that came out a bit in the interview. I hope it did, but I don't think it perhaps did enough. I feel that while it's certainly right to oppose a lot of the policies of Donald Trump and the MAGA movement, I guess I recoil at referring to them as monsters and treating them as such. And maybe that's just me being the squishy Democrat who's not okay with othering people. But I guess I'm not at a point where I'm willing to give up as much of what I think are basic, decent values in terms of how you conduct yourself and how you campaign. Maybe it's because I don't see Donald Trump and the MAGA movement as much of a threat to democracy as many of my fellow left-wing folks do. I don't know. But again, I just felt like I didn't want to end things without really expressing my misgivings at what Professor Fish is suggesting, even if, again, he might very well be right. He's a very smart guy. It's a fascinating book, and I would absolutely recommend that people check it out because it's a perspective on political messaging and politics in the 21st century that I think is very valuable. Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you're not already a supporter of the show, I hope you'll consider becoming one because without our supporters, we wouldn't be able to do this. And when you become a supporter, you get not just that warm, fuzzy feeling knowing that you're supporting a good cause. I like to think we're a good cause, but you also get stuff like ad-free versions of everything we put out. You get our supporter exclusive midweek show, the full length of that, not just the preview. And you also get to be part of our Discord group if you want. And there's always some interesting conversations going on there. At the $10 a month level or more, you get to actually be part of the episodes Jay and I do, if that's something you're interested in. So there's a lot of stuff is what I am saying. And I hope you'll consider checking it out. And to do that, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. If you want to support us on Venmo, we're at Politics Guys. You can also support the show through PayPal. And all of our support links are always in the show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And as always, I want to close with a very special thank you to our wonderful executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,